If you are Turkish, or if your family traces its roots back to Turkey, what you're about to hear may completely change the way you see your own identity. For centuries, the story seems simple. The Turkish people descend from the nomadic Turkic tribes of Central Asia, warriors who rode out of the steppes, swept across continents, and eventually built one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. That is the story taught in schools. That is the story carved into monuments. But when scientists finally sequenced the DNA of modern Turkish populations and compared it to both ancient Anatolian remains and the DNA of true Central Asian Turkic groups, the results did not match the legend at all. What they found instead was stranger, older, and far more complicated than anyone expected. And it raises a question that goes far beyond Turkey. It asks whether a nation's identity can survive even when its genetic story does not match its cultural one. To understand why this discovery shocked researchers, you have to go back much further than the Turkic migrations. You have to go back roughly 10,000 years to a region known as Anatolia, the peninsula that today makes up the Asian part of Turkey. Long before anyone spoke a Turkic language in this land, Anatolia was already one of the most important places in human history. It was here, in the hills of the Fertile Crescent, that some of the earliest farming communities on Earth took root. Ancient sites like Çatalhöyük and Göbekli Tepe reveal a population that was settled, agricultural, and deeply rooted in the land thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt were built. These were not nomads. These were builders, farmers, and some of the first people in human history to domesticate crops and animals. Genetic studies of skeletons from this era show a population with a distinct genetic signature, one that would go on to spread across Europe as farming techniques migrated westward. In fact, much of the DNA carried by modern Europeans today traces back in part to these early Anatolian farmers. This is the first major twist in the story. Long before anyone associated Anatolia with Turkish identity, the region was already exporting its genetic legacy across an entire continent. The land itself has always been a genetic crossroads, not a genetic island. And that fact becomes critically important once you understand what happened next. Researchers who first sequenced ancient skeletal remains from sites across central and western Anatolia noticed something remarkable. The genetic markers found in these 10,000-year-old farmers were not confined to the region. Nearly identical genetic signatures began showing up in Neolithic farming sites across Greece, the Balkans, and eventually as far west as Britain and Scandinavia. This meant that the spread of agriculture into Europe was not simply an idea that traveled from mind to mind. It was, in large part, an actual migration of people, farmers leaving Anatolia and gradually replacing or mixing with the hunter-gatherer populations who had lived across Europe for tens of thousands of years before them. For scientists, this transformed the way they understood the earliest chapters of European history, and it planted Anatolia firmly at the center of the story, not as a distant backdrop, but as one of the true origin points of the modern European gene pool. Over the following millennia, Anatolia did not remain isolated. It became one of the most fought over, traded through, and settled regions in the ancient world. The Hittites built an empire here around 1600 BCE, leaving behind cuneiform tablets and monumental fortresses. Later came the Phrygians, the Lydians, and eventually the Greeks, who established coastal cities that flourished for centuries. Persian armies marched through. Alexander the Great conquered the region on his way east. Roman legions later absorbed it into their empire, and when Rome split, Anatolia became the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years, with Constantinople as its glittering capital. Each of these waves left genetic traces behind. Greek settlers, Roman soldiers, Armenian communities, Georgian and Caucasian populations, Jewish merchants, and countless others all contributed to the genetic tapestry of the region long before a single Turkic-speaking group ever set foot on Anatolian soil. Consider just how long this layering process lasted. The Hittite Empire rose and fell over 3,000 years ago. Greek city-states like Miletus, Ephesus, and Halicarnassus were thriving centers of trade and philosophy along the Aegean coast for over 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. When Rome eventually absorbed Anatolia into its empire, it inherited a population that had already been shaped by centuries of Greek colonization, Persian administration, and countless smaller kingdoms rising and falling in between. By the time Constantinople was founded as the new capital of the Roman world in 330 CE, Anatolia was arguably one of the most densely populated, most urbanized, and most genetically diverse regions on the planet. For the next 11 centuries, it remained the core of the Byzantine Empire, a Greek-speaking Christian civilization that defended this land, cultivated it, and filled it with cities, churches, and farms long before any Turkic army crossed its borders. This is the population, deeply rooted, ancient, and already tremendously mixed, that the incoming Turkic groups would eventually settle among. This is where the story most people know finally begins. Starting in the 11th century, Turkic-speaking nomadic groups from Central Asia, most notably the Seljuks, began migrating westward. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, Seljuk forces decisively defeated the Byzantine army, opening the gates of Anatolia to Turkic settlement for the first time. Over the following centuries, waves of Turkic tribes moved into the region, eventually giving rise to the Ottoman Empire, which would go on to rule for over 600 years and control territories stretching from the Balkans to North Africa to the Middle East. By the time the Ottoman Empire reached its height, the Turkish language, Turkish culture, and Turkish political identity dominated the entire region. It is easy to assume, given this history, that the genetic makeup of modern Turkey would closely resemble the genetic makeup of Central Asia, the original homeland of the Turkic peoples. This is exactly what scientists expected to find when they began large-scale genetic studies of the Turkish population. It is not what they found. It is worth pausing here to consider the sheer scale of what happened during those centuries of Turkic migration. Historians estimate that the number of Turkic-speaking nomads who actually crossed into Anatolia during the Seljuk and early Ottoman periods was, relative to the existing Byzantine and Anatolian population, comparatively small. Anatolia, at the time of the Seljuk conquest, is believed to have held a population of several million people, spread across cities, farming villages, and coastal towns that had existed for centuries. The incoming Turkic groups, while militarily dominant and politically transformative, numbered in the hundreds of thousands rather than the millions. This demographic imbalance is central to understanding what the DNA evidence would eventually reveal. A conquering group does not need to outnumber the population it rules in order to reshape the population's language, religion, and identity. It only needs to control the institutions that matter most: the government, the military, the courts, and eventually the schools and the mosques. When researchers compared the DNA of modern Turkish citizens to the DNA of populations in Central Asia, places like modern Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Mongolia, the genetic overlap was surprisingly small. Instead of showing a population dominated by Central Asian ancestry, the DNA of modern Turks looked overwhelmingly similar to the populations that had lived in and around Anatolia and the surrounding Mediterranean and Caucasus regions for thousands of years before the Turkic migrations ever happened. Studies using genome-wide data placed the Central Asian genetic contribution to the modern Turkish gene pool at a relatively small percentage, often estimated in various academic studies to fall somewhere in the range of 10 to 30%, with many populations clustering even lower than that. The majority of modern Turkish ancestry, according to these studies, traces back to the pre-existing populations of Anatolia, the Caucasus, the Balkans, and the wider Near East, the very same groups who had already been living in and around this region for millennia before the Seljuks or the Ottomans arrived. The methods researchers used to reach these conclusions are worth understanding, because they reveal just how much confidence scientists can place in these findings. Modern population geneticists typically rely on genome-wide SNP data, meaning they scan hundreds of thousands of specific points across an individual's DNA and compare the patterns to reference populations from around the world. Using statistical tools like admixture analysis and principal component analysis, researchers can essentially place an individual's genome on a map, showing how closely it clusters with different ancestral populations. When Turkish genomes are run through this kind of analysis, they consistently cluster closest to populations from the Eastern Mediterranean, the Caucasus, and the Near East, forming a distinct cluster that sits apart from true Central Asian populations, like the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, or the Uyghurs. Only when researchers add a Central Asian ancestral component to the model does a modest secondary signal appear, confirming that some Turkic-related ancestry is present, but that it represents a minority contribution layered onto a much larger, older foundation. This finding stunned many people when it was first published, because it seemed to contradict everything the historical narrative implied. If the Turkic tribes conquered and ruled the region for hundreds of years, why does their genetic footprint appear so limited? The answer lies in something scientists call the elite dominance model, a pattern that shows up again and again throughout human history whenever a smaller group conquers and rules over a much larger existing population. In this model, a relatively small number of incoming warriors, administrators, and settlers take control of a region's political, military, and cultural institutions. They do not necessarily replace the existing population. Instead, they intermarry with local communities, and over time, their language, religion, and cultural practices spread throughout the population, even though their actual genetic contribution remains a minority. The local population, vastly outnumbering the newcomers, gradually adopts the language and identity of the ruling elite, while continuing to carry mostly local ancestry passed down from their own ancestors, going back thousands of years. This pattern explains why modern Turkey speaks a Turkic language, follows cultural traditions with deep roots in Central Asian Turkic history, and identifies strongly with a Turkic heritage, while the underlying DNA of most Turkish citizens tells a very different story, one rooted far more in ancient Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the broader Mediterranean world than in the steppes of Central Asia. In other words, being Turkish today is overwhelmingly a matter of language, culture, and shared history rather than a matter of shared ancestry with the original Turkic-speaking nomads. This is not unique to Turkey. Similar patterns have been documented in Hungary, where the Hungarian language arrived with Magyar tribes from the Ural region, but the majority of modern Hungarian DNA traces back to pre-existing European populations. It has also been documented in parts of England, where Anglo-Saxon language and culture spread widely, while genetic replacement of the existing Romano-British population was far more limited than once assumed. Turkey simply provides one of the clearest and most dramatic examples of this phenomenon because the contrast between the cultural narrative and the genetic reality is so stark. The Hungarian comparison is particularly striking when placed side by side with Turkey. The Magyar tribes who settled the Carpathian Basin in the 9th century arrived from a region far to the east, bringing with them a language completely unrelated to the Slavic and Germanic languages spoken by their new neighbors. Just as in Anatolia, the incoming group was politically dominant but numerically limited. Over the following centuries, the local population gradually adopted the Hungarian language, while genetic studies show that the majority of modern Hungarian ancestry still traces back to the pre-existing European populations of the region, with only a modest signal of the original steppe ancestry carried by the Magyar conquerors. Two nations, thousands of miles apart, following almost the exact same historical pattern. A small but powerful group arriving, reshaping the language and political identity of an entire population, while the deeper genetic story continues largely unbroken beneath the surface. But the story does not end there, because Turkey itself is far from genetically uniform. And this is where things become even more interesting. Researchers who have studied regional variation within Turkey have found significant differences depending on where in the country a sample comes from. Populations in western and coastal regions of Turkey, closer to the Aegean and Mediterranean seas, tend to show stronger genetic affinities with Greek, Balkan, and broader southern European populations, a reflection of thousands of years of Greek settlement, trade, and cultural exchange along these coastlines. Populations in eastern and southeastern Turkey, closer to the Caucasus and the borders with Armenia, Georgia, Iran, and Iraq, show stronger genetic affinities with Caucasian and Near Eastern populations, reflecting the region's deep historical ties to Armenian, Kurdish, Assyrian, and Caucasian communities that have lived in this area for thousands of years. Central Anatolian populations often show a blend of these influences, along with a somewhat higher, though still relatively modest, signal of Central Asian ancestry compared to the coastal regions. This regional variation makes sense once you consider the sheer scale and diversity of Anatolia's history. It was never a single, homogeneous population waiting to be conquered. It was a mosaic of different peoples, languages, and cultures, layered on top of each other over thousands of years, with the Turkic migrations representing just one layer among many. Cities like Izmir and Antalya, sitting along the Aegean and Mediterranean coastlines, carry the genetic fingerprints of thousands of years of Greek and Roman settlement, visible even today in the DNA of local families who have lived in these port cities for generations. Cities like Van and Diyarbakir, in the country's southeast, sit at the crossroads of Armenian, Kurdish, and Mesopotamian history, and their populations reflect that deep and complicated heritage. Even within a single city, researchers have found meaningful genetic variation between neighborhoods and families, a living record of centuries of migration, trade, and settlement that no single national narrative could ever fully capture. This is part of why population geneticists increasingly describe Turkey not as one genetic population, but as a genetic mosaic, a patchwork stitched together from Anatolia's extraordinarily long and layered human history. Y chromosome studies, which trace paternal lineage, and mitochondrial DNA studies, which trace maternal lineage, have added another fascinating dimension to this picture. In many populations that experience conquest by a smaller group of male-dominated invaders, researchers often find a pattern where the paternal lineage shows more evidence of the invading group than the maternal lineage does. This happens because conquering forces are often disproportionately male, and their genetic contribution spreads primarily through unions with local women, whose own maternal lineages continue largely uninterrupted. Some studies of the Turkish population have found hints of this pattern, with certain paternal lineages showing slightly stronger connections to Central Asian and even South Siberian populations than the overall autosomal or whole genome data would suggest. Even so, the overall picture remains consistent. The dominant genetic story of Turkey is one of continuity with the ancient populations of Anatolia and its surrounding regions, with the Turkic migrations representing an important but numerically limited contribution layered on top of a much older foundation. There is also a deeper biological explanation for why paternal lineages sometimes tell a slightly different story than the rest of the genome. Throughout history, conquering armies were composed almost entirely of men, often traveling without their families across vast distances. When these men settled in a new land, they frequently married local women, whose children would then carry one Turkic-descended paternal line alongside an overwhelmingly local set of ancestors on every other branch of the family tree. Multiply this pattern across many generations and many families, and you get a population where a noticeable minority of male lineages point back toward Central Asia, while the vast majority of the total genome, inherited from thousands of ancestors on both sides of every family tree, points back toward Anatolia and its neighboring regions. This is not a flaw in the data. It is a near-perfect illustration of exactly how the elite dominance model plays out at the molecular level, one lineage carrying the story of conquest, while the rest of the genome carries the much older story of continuity. What makes this discovery so powerful is not just the science itself, but what it reveals about the nature of identity. For over 900 years, the descendants of Anatolia's ancient farmers, its Hittite subjects, its Greek and Roman citizens, its Byzantine population, and its Armenian and Caucasian neighbors have called themselves Turkish. They speak a language that arrived from the steppes of Central Asia. They honor a history that includes Seljuk sultans and Ottoman emperors. They celebrate a cultural heritage built on centuries of Turkic tradition. And yet, when you look at their DNA, most of them are, in a very real biological sense, the direct descendants of people who were farming, building cities, and living in Anatolia long before any Turkic language was ever spoken there. This is not a contradiction. It is one of the clearest examples in human history of how identity is built through shared language, shared history, shared religion, and shared culture, not simply through shared bloodlines. The Turkish identity that exists today was not imposed onto an empty land. It was woven together from thousands of years of Anatolian ancestry, combined with a powerful cultural and linguistic transformation brought by a comparatively small number of Turkic settlers whose influence on language and governance far outweighed their influence on the actual gene pool. It is worth noting that Turkish scientists and international research teams have continued to expand this picture in recent years, sequencing additional ancient skeletons from sites across Anatolia dating to the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and the medieval period. Each new set of samples adds more detail to the timeline, allowing researchers to watch, generation by generation, how the genetic composition of the region shifted, or in many cases, stayed remarkably stable, across thousands of years of political upheaval. What these studies consistently show is not a single dramatic replacement event, but a slow, continuous process of small-scale migration, intermarriage, and cultural blending, stretching back to the very first farming communities of the Neolithic period. The Turkic migrations of the 11th century, dramatic and historically decisive as they were, appear in this longer timeline as one wave among many, arriving on top of a population that had already absorbed and blended with Hittites, Greeks, Persians, Romans, Armenians, and countless others long before. This raises a bigger question that extends far beyond Turkey, one that applies to almost every modern nation on Earth. How many of the identities we consider fixed and ancient are actually the product of relatively recent cultural shifts layered on top of much older, deeper genetic histories? The Turkish case is not an isolated anomaly. It is a window into how human history actually works. Nations are not simply the product of one group of people multiplying and spreading across a territory. They are the product of migration, conquest, intermarriage, cultural adoption, and the slow blending of many different peoples over thousands of years. Language can spread far faster than genes. Religion can spread far faster than genes. Political power can spread far faster than genes. And in the case of Turkey, all three of these forces combine to create one of the most successful and enduring identities in world history, even though the underlying DNA tells a story that is far older, far more diverse, and far more rooted in Anatolia itself than the popular narrative ever suggested. It is also worth considering how the Ottoman Empire itself, once established, continued to reshape the genetic landscape of the region long after the initial Turkic migrations had ended. As the empire expanded across the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa, it absorbed enormous numbers of new subjects, many of whom eventually converted to Islam, adopted Ottoman Turkish culture, and over generations came to identify as Turkish themselves. Bosnian, Albanian, Circassian, Crimean Tatar, Kurdish, and Arab families all became woven into the fabric of Ottoman and later Turkish society, each contributing their own genetic threads to an already complex tapestry. The forced and voluntary population exchanges of the early 20th century, along with waves of migration from the Balkans and the Caucasus following the empire's collapse, added even more layers to this story. Millions of Muslims from the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Crimea resettled in Anatolia during this period, further diversifying the genetic makeup of the modern Turkish population and adding yet another chapter to a story that was already thousands of years in the making. None of this diminishes the significance of the Turkic migrations or the Ottoman legacy. If anything, it makes that legacy even more remarkable. A relatively small number of nomadic warriors and settlers managed to reshape the language, religion, and political identity of an entire region stretching across Anatolia and beyond, creating an empire that lasted for over 600 years and left a cultural footprint that still defines the region today. That is an extraordinary historical achievement, one built not on genetic replacement, but on the profound power of culture, language, faith, and governance to reshape how millions of people understand themselves. The ancient farmers of Seljuk, the subjects of the Hittite Empire, the citizens of Byzantine Constantinople, and the descendants of countless Caucasian, Armenian, Greek, and Near Eastern communities did not disappear when the Seljuks and Ottomans arrived. They became Turkish, carrying their ancient DNA forward into a new identity built on a new language and a new political order. So when you look at a map of modern Turkey today, you're not looking at the descendants of a single Central Asian tribe that swept in and replaced everyone who came before. You're looking at the living continuation of nearly 10,000 years of Anatolian history, layered with Hittite, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Armenian, Caucasian, and eventually Turkic influence, all woven together into one of the most complex and fascinating genetic and cultural stories on the planet. The steppe warriors who crossed into Anatolia nearly 1,000 years ago did not erase the past. They became part of a much older story that was already unfolding long before they arrived, and in doing so, they created something entirely new, a nation whose language points east toward Central Asia, but whose DNA points overwhelmingly toward the ancient soil of Anatolia itself. There is also something worth reflecting on here about how humans tend to think about belonging. Most of us assume that identity requires bloodline purity, that being truly Turkish or truly anything means descending in an unbroken genetic line from the founders of that identity. The science tells a different, more honest story. Human populations have always moved, mixed, and merged. The very idea of a genetically pure nation, untouched by outside ancestry, essentially does not exist anywhere on Earth once you look closely enough at the DNA. What holds a nation together across generations is rarely genetics. It is shared language, shared memory, shared struggle, and shared culture, passed down and reinforced far more powerfully than any strand of DNA ever could be. In this sense, the story of Turkish origins is not really a story about Turkey at all. It is a story about what it truly means to belong to a people, and it suggests that the answer has far less to do with ancestry charts than most of us have ever been taught to believe. This is what makes the science of ancient DNA so powerful. It does not simply confirm the stories we already believe. It challenges them, complicates them, and often reveals a version of history that is far richer than the simplified narratives passed down through generations. The story of Turkish origins is not a story of one people replacing another. It is a story of layers, of farmers and empires, of conquest and blending, of language triumphing where genetics did not fully follow. It is a reminder that the people living in any given place today are almost always the product of thousands of years of movement, mixture, and adaptation, and that the labels we use to describe ourselves, whether Turkish, Greek, Armenian, or any other identity, are as much cultural inheritances as they are biological ones. Think for a moment about your own family. Most people can name their grandparents and maybe their great-grandparents, but almost no one can trace their ancestry back even a few hundred years with real certainty, let alone 1,000. Every single person watching this video carries within their own DNA a similarly layered, similarly surprising story, whether their ancestors came from Anatolia, South Asia, Europe, Africa, or the Americas. Migration is not the exception in human history. It is the rule. Every population alive today is the product of countless waves of movement, conquest, trade, and intermarriage stretching back tens of thousands of years. And every national identity we take for granted today was, at some point, forged out of exactly this kind of blending. Turkey simply happens to have one of the best documented and most thoroughly studied examples of this process, thanks to its extraordinary depth of written history combined with an increasingly rich body of ancient DNA evidence. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you, this is only the beginning. Nearly every population on Earth has a similar story buried in its DNA, one that often looks nothing like the traditional narrative taught in schools. Make sure you are subscribed, because in the next video, we are going to dig into the ancient DNA of another population whose modern identity may be hiding an equally surprising genetic past. If you found this breakdown valuable, leave a comment and let us know which population's DNA story you want uncovered next. The past is gone, but the evidence remains, and it is often far stranger than the legend.